Hello, and welcome to the Colorado Grain Chains Homeschool Webinar Series. My name is Dan Waldvogel, and I am the Membership Coordinator with the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. Thank you for joining us. Today, you are in for a treat. We have Bob Quinn, a farmer from Montana, also known as the King of Kamut, joining us. Before I get to his introduction, I need to let you know that during this interview, I did not get the recording started appropriately, so I will introduce him. I will provide a brief synopsis of the start of his speech and presentation, and then we will cut directly to the actual webinar. So without any further ado, I will speak a little bit about Bob Quinn. He is the founder of Kamut International, which we'll learn more about today. He spends his summers farming and his winters traveling to conventions and food shows where he promotes organic agriculture and the Kamut brand Ancient Wheat. I first met Bob at the UCCS Grain School, and it was a wonderful presentation and very entertaining and educational as well. Bob also has a blog called Bob Quinn Organic Farmer, and he recently published a book called Grain by Grain, A Quest to Revive Ancient Wheat, Rural Jobs, and Healthy Food. So that is my introduction for Bob. As he first came on, he was mentioning that he grew up on a farm in north central Montana. He is now operating it. His grandfather started it in 1920, so they're enjoying their 100-year anniversary this year. He studied at Montana State University, and he said he studied his two loves, botany and science, and he really thought that he was going to continue down that path as an academic, and then life transitioned and changed for him. So at this point, we will cut directly to Bob's presentation. Thank you for joining us.
After a couple of years in business in California, I returned to the farm, and now the farm has become my whole laboratory and my garden. And when we first got here, my folks were still on the farm, and even though it was 2,400 acres, it wasn't quite big enough for two families full-time. So I started a small business to direct market our grain to whole grain bakers in Southern California. That's what we did first, starting in '83. And they started asking me about getting organic grain for them. So in '84, we started selling organic grain from a organic farmer I found about 300 miles away in northeast Montana. And then they wanted stone ground flour. Well, I said, well, why don't you put the mill in your bakery? Then it'd be fresh. And they said, oh, no, we can't bother with that in California with all of our air laws and the regulations. So they told me, you put it in Montana, we'll buy everything you can produce. So I put it in Montana, and we started into the flour milling business, and that business became known as Montana Flour and Grain. And that was very successful and really springboard that took me to food shows that you mentioned and to brand new markets that I never would have imagined. And one of those had to deal with an ancient wheat that I had seen when I was a kid. Reportedly came out of a tomb in Egypt. When I went to Egypt, I found that wasn't true. But when I went to Turkey, they told me it came off of Noah's Ark, so you can take whatever legend you want. And we started passing it around to friends after having made it into pasta. And one lady said, I can't eat wheat at all, but I can eat this just fine, and it makes me feel better. And once we were told that, then we started taking the thing a whole different look at it and taking it much more seriously. We registered a trademark, the Kamut trademark. Kamut is an ancient Egyptian word for wheat. Since at that time we thought it was from Egypt, but it was way before I started traveling. We took that word, and I wanted to protect it from those who would kind of bastardize it and make cross it and with modern wheat and maybe change it and still try to pan it off as ancient. So with a trademark, doesn't mean that we own the grain or that we prohibit anybody from growing it. Anybody can grow it, whatever they want. But if they want to sell it as Kamut brand, then they have to be part of our program. And we guarantee that it's never hybridized, that it's 100% ancient grain. Of course, there's never any GMOs in it, and it's always organic. within a couple of years of starting to buy organic grain and selling it, I met several organic farmers and became very interested in organic agriculture. And within just a few years, started experimenting on my own farm. And I guess you could say I was an instant convert. Our first crop was in 87. And by 88, we used our last chemicals in 88 in our farm. So within 3 years, we will have been in 3 years, as many years organic as we were chemical. After my dad was one of the first ones to start with chemical agriculture in the early 50s. So that's kind of an exciting milestone. And the other thing that we tried to do is revitalize rural Montana, in our case. In our little town of Big Sandy has gone from 1,000 when I was in high school down to 600 or so now. They just closed the last elevator this year in town. We used to have 5 grain elevators when I was growing up. Most of the businesses are gone. Half of my neighbors are gone. And this is all a result, really, I think, of industrialization of agriculture and relying on large industrial models and chemical farming. And so when people say chemistry, better living through chemistry, it's not better living for rural America, because most of our neighbors are going broke or are in very dire straits, except for the very biggest ones. But most of my neighbors are gone. So I see that as not progress. And so with the organic, which adds more value and focuses on health, one of my main themes now is to reconnect food and health and eat our way healthy and allow farmers to make a fair share of that by adding value so that people can pay more for their food by paying less for their medicines, because they're not as sick all the time. We pay over 18, 19% nationally for medical expenses in America, and our food only costs us 8 to 9%. 50 years, those two numbers were reversed. And I think we need to move the healthcare costs down and move the cost of food, which pays for the value and a fair price to farmers and everybody else involved with the handling and making of the food, processing of it, a fair wage. So that's what I've been trying to do. One thing I've been working on the last few years is growing my own food as much as possible. And right now, when I'm home, about 80% of what I eat is what I grow here in the farm. And even these days, so this morning, one of the things we brought to our small town is a little company that makes a snack out of this ancient grain of Kamut. It's called crackling Kamut. It's really yummy. It has free ingredients, the Ohio Lake safflower oil, which we also make and process on our farm. I'll tell you about in a second. Sea salt and the grain. So when the farmers can sell grain by the ounce instead of by the ton or the carload, it really helps the bottom line. And this is what we're trying, and it gives more jobs to the local economy. So, for example, this morning I had crackling Kamut with a little sugar and cinnamon called churro, and a little half and half from Organic Valley. And since I don't have a milk cow anymore, and that was my breakfast. So and then I go from there to lunch. So one of the things that we have left now in our root cellar are potatoes. So this is a huckleberry gold potato. It's purple on the outside, yellow on the inside. And then it has a low glycemic index because it has a lot of resistant starch. So I'm working with a neighboring Indian reservation at Rocky Boy, trying to help them grow their own food and foods that are helpful for their diabetes and other problems that they have health-wise. And if we can grow food that really helps the health condition rather than aggravates it, we're really a lot better off. We still have in the garage some small spaghetti squash from last year. These are the last, they have a hard rind on them. These are the last squash really that I have in storage that last this long, but they're still good. I make a lot of sauerkraut with cabbage. This is regular sauerkraut. We also make red sauerkraut with red cabbage and beets. It's really yummy. I pickle a lot of pickled beets, and so I have that a lot. And then I freeze. This is a frozen soup, vegetable soup kind of base. So in the fall, I just take all the vegetables I have and just cook them up and then freeze them for soup. I also freeze tomatoes. Here's my tomatoes from last year that I can throw in stir fry and make pasta sauce and things like that. I mean, you can't cut them like they're fresh, but those are the kinds of things that we that we can do. And the oil barn, or the safflower I also mentioned, we grow high oleic safflower oil, which is the best oil for high temperature cooking, for stir fry, for popcorn and that sort of thing. We crush it on the farm. You see how beautiful the color is. It's not deodorized or decolorized. It's got all the vitamins and minerals that is in the oil seed. And we cold press it and bottle it. And now we're working with Patrick Connery in Fort Collins and on a extension of the oil barn into Colorado. We'll have an oil barn Colorado with our oil available for the folks down there. So we're really excited about that. So after farming for 40 years, I decided that I had my turn. And since none of my kids were showing up on the farm, I rented it out to two of my employees. One had worked for me for 6 years and one for 2 years. And now they're having their turn at farming. And so I'm devoting my time in the summer to growing these vegetables. I do a lot of experiments with dryland vegetables. We don't have irrigation on our farm. So we found that even with 13 inches of rain a year, we can grow a lot of stuff under dryland conditions. So I'm experimenting with that. I'm experimenting with winter hardiness grain that we normally plant in the spring that we're now planting in the fall because of the climate chaos, I call it, rather than climate change. I think it's just chaotic. And in order to protect ourselves from that, we can grow wider and wider diversities, and we can grow things that are more hardy in the winter, get through the winter, and then ripen before the heat, which is coming hotter sooner and drier sooner in our area, hits us in the summertime. So the other good news with being organic, of course, we're contributing to this climate chaos by sequestering more carbon and by reducing the amount of chemical fertilizers being needed, which emits a huge amount of carbon gases into the atmosphere. So I should mention, I always wear my Kamut, my hat, so that it's near and dear, and I can show people and demonstrate it, and it's a lot easier when I travel to carry it in my hat in my suitcase. So anyway, that is a little bit of my story. I'm thrilled to be with you, and I'm glad to answer any questions that might come up. That's just really touching a lot of tips of a lot of mountains I climb all the time. But that's where I am, and that's what I've been involved with the last little while.
Great. Well, thank you, Bob. And as questions roll in, I guess I'll just start with what's you mentioned the benefit of being able to sell by the ounce. How have you been able to develop some of those markets? Do you have any advice or any stories there about how you were able to get to develop those type of products in those markets and critical partners along the way?
Well, that's a good question. We're really just in the very beginning of market development for our Kamut snacks. In fact, most of them are still sold just in Montana. So we started going around where it was closest and having people taste them. It's like corn nuts without your dentist. If you like corn nuts, you're gonna love these because they have a nice crunch and a crackle and a great flavor, but they're not so hard and they don't crack your teeth. But it is a challenge to get out to the larger markets, and we've been to food shows and we've had lots of nibbles and bites, and we've had some success getting into schools here in Montana for lunch programs and after school programs and stuff like that. We're in some gas stations, some health food stores in Montana, but that's about as far as we've gotten so far. So we're just on the verge of getting started really with that. We're trying to follow the model that I use for all the other businesses I've had with the Montana Flour and Grain and with the Kamut project. We just start small, and we don't spend lots of money on advertising. We just go out and introduce it to customers who think might have some interest and are in a good position to be good customers for us. And we make personal contacts with them and try to go visit them in their home, in their factories, in their homes of business. After we make acquaintance at the food shows, that's been our biggest, for me, that was my biggest opportunity to meet people, was going to food shows. And we would go to 2 or 3 a year in America. And then when we started going to Europe, I'd go to 2 or 3 a year in Europe, and one or two in Canada. So that was our main contact. And besides that, once we got customers, we try to go visit them personally every year, the largest ones, and make sure that everything was going well and that they were happy, and that if they had any problems, we could answer them. We would be in position to do that or do the research required to help them. So that's what we did. We tried to provide a lot of customer service that's not normally done.
Hey Bob, this is Andy from the Colorado Grain Chain, and
hi, Andy.
We've talked a lot over the years, and I've learned so much from you about wheat variety and what role that plays in gut health and human health. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, after this lady that I mentioned early on first told us that she couldn't eat any wheat, but yet she could eat this ancient grain, this Kamut brand pasta we gave her without any problem. In fact, it made her feel better. That opened up a whole new world of questions for me. And we tried to find researchers in America who would do the research comparing modern wheat and ancient wheat, and we couldn't find anybody who was interested 20, 30 years ago, because everybody said, well, wheat is fine, and if people think they have trouble, it's mostly in their head. And so there was little sympathy nor interest in studying this. But in Italy, I found quite a different attitude. If Italians can't eat pasta, they don't just go down to the local store, at least 30 years ago, and ask for something wheat-free, gluten-free. They want their pasta as they've always eaten it, and they want to know why they can't. And so there was a lot of interest in University of Bologna and University of Florence in the medical research teaching hospital there to do research with us. So we provided, over the course of 10 or 15 years, we provided a couple $1 million from donations that we made to those universities to do research and comparing modern wheat and ancient wheat. And the results have been over 32 different peer-reviewed journal articles that the last 10 years or so has been, or 5 years or about 8 maybe, has been focused on human clinical trials. So once we found, we did one animal study and we saw an indication of a difference in inflammatory activity. The ancient wheat reduced inflammation. And once we saw that, knowing that inflammation is tied to all chronic diseases, we immediately started studying human diseases, chronic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, those kinds of things. And we found the same results with every single one. We would have double-blind studies, so people didn't really know what they're eating. And then if it was something like irritable bowel syndrome, they filled out reports how they felt. But with diabetes and heart disease, you don't feel much different. So they were tested with blood tests. And we found increases in magnesium and iron and zinc and calcium in the blood. We found decreases in inflammation on ancient wheat diet. We found increases in the antioxidant capacity on an ancient wheat diet. So there are huge, huge differences. The biggest one was the inflammation, however. It was 35 to 45% decreased. And the researchers were just astounded by this. They hardly could believe it. That's way more than you could get with any kind of medicine or pills on the market. So just by eating healthy, you can become healthier. This is the takeaway from this. And also how much we have done to change wheat just to get high yields and big low volumes of air bread that became the American standard, how much that's done to detract from the health of that product. And to me, it opened up a whole new understanding of the importance of tying nutrition with food rather than just yield and cheap to food. And that's kind of what the American role has been. The goal of the government has been cheap food, abundant food, and with no connection with health, because we can buy pills for health after all. So that's what they've done. So that's really opened up an understanding of wheat, particularly how much different that has changed. 20% of the people in America now, up to that, at least that's what a lot of studies indicate, can no longer eat wheat, normal wheat, modern wheat, without difficulty. And that's a crying shame. We have really detracted from something that used to be the staff of life, and we need to get back to where it is, that same position once again.
And what do you think the next steps are? You know, it kind of blows my mind to read your book, see other medical studies being done throughout the world, have this evidence growing while the sensitivity, and it's not even making the front page of the food section, let alone the New York Times.
Well, you know, in days of old, when you went against dogma, they burnt you. They burnt you at the stake. Well, we're just thankful that we're not being burnt at the stake, but we certainly are going against dogma, and that is punished in different ways nowadays, mostly by ridicule, by ignoring, being ignored, that sort of thing. However, there's a small but growing segment that have experienced the difference for themselves. What you're doing in your bakery and your customers, they're experiencing it for themselves, the difference. And so they're starting to ask questions and starting to demand better food. And I think that's how it's going to grow. The government's certainly not going to change. They are so much influenced by giant corporate chemical interests in agriculture that they're not going to change until they've prepared to change and make money from a change. And they're not doing that now. They're making plenty of money the way it is. They're extracting most of the wealth out of rural America to their own use, and that's they have everything going their way. So that's why you don't see or hear, I think, too much about the alternative, because the people in control don't want the alternative. They want things to continue the way they are.
Well, we're not going to get burned at the stake, Bob, not while I'm on watch. And,
okay,
you know, and this pandemic has opened up all these little doors, and there's all these little cracks to sneak through to make positive change. So I wonder, it'd be great to have an offline, you know, discussion like we've been having with Mark Nightingale and Tom Leonard and other folks, and see, hey, what's our next plan of attack to bring this stuff to the forefront, you know, bring the old stuff back.
That's exactly right. You know, people thought we were strange sometimes when we talked about regional food production and depending on local slaughterhouses, local mills, local bakeries, community production of basics of at least the basics of your food. People say, why would you want to do that? It's going to be more expensive. Everything's so efficient now. But the one thing this pandemic has done has really changed people's attitudes, I think, about that. They see that the store shelves have gone empty on them. Their supply chain is not even in this country sometimes. Some things are coming from overseas or from China in many cases. And they see, wow, that's not a very smart position to be in. And if you bring it home and decentralize it, so we can do more than just bring it home and keep efficiency and centralization and of everything. We can decentralize it and build small communities and rural communities up again and have more communities, even the big cities, to be fed closer to where they live. And if we fed everybody closer to where they live, that, in my mind, is really contributing to homeland security and not only secure in an economic sense, but also in just a feeding your family sense, which most people just took for granted until this pandemic took off.
Well, and the math and the data behind you know, needing to you know, feed the world and increase our food supply for our own American needs and so forth. What are the statistics on overproduction in the U.S. And what are the statistics on grocery store waste?
Well, if you talk about food waste, so there's two, when people talk to me about feeding the world, because this is what the chemical marketers pound this drum day in and day out, so that even most politicians believe it. This is a bunch of garbage. This is completely made up in their own mind. North America, and talking about American agriculture, cannot feed the world. The Western world feeds now 1/3 of the world, about. But 3/4 of the world's population is in Africa and Asia. So mostly they're feeding themselves through small, well, we call them peasant farms, but right in their own region. And if you would, and research has demonstrated in both Africa and in Asia and India, that if you converted those farms to a regenerative organic system, back to where they were millennia ago, even where they were 100 years ago, they would increase their yields by 2 or 3 times. That's one way to feed the world. We don't have to worry about that. If we help them convert, then we're certainly not going to convert them to modern agriculture. Who's going to pay for all the chemicals? They don't have cash for that. And even in America, we're paying for the chemicals a lot historically through government subsidies. So that's a bunch of fallacy. But the thing that the other half of the question is the one you just mentioned on waste. If we look at the waste of food in the world, it's 40 to 50%. So we could double our consumption, or we could double our food, I guess you could say, not our consumption. We could double the food available to us just by not wasting it. And it goes all the way from, in the Western world, most of that waste happens after it gets to the grocery store. In the underdeveloped countries, most of it happens because it's lost before it gets that far, in storage and transportation and that sort of thing, because it's not developed, and the bugs get it, or the rain gets it, or the rats or something. But those are the things that we could do. Another thing, since you're in the baking business, I'm in the wheat growing business, we can increase the yield on wheat nationally by 1/3 overnight if everyone ate whole grain instead of white flour, because we're throwing away 1/3 of our grain. So we're feeding it to the pigs. Pigs are eating better than we are. If we ate whole grain, we would be utilizing 100% of the grain instead of 70%. So it's an equivalent of increasing our yield by 30%. It's one simple change. Well, it's not so simple. It's a huge change, but it's a change that really makes sense, because it's not only more nutritious. I mean, it really helps digestion and so many other things. To eat whole grain, and it's delicious.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
Yeah, Bob, we've had a couple of questions come in just about, the idea of scale and working within, expanding to other small farms. So one question here was, what is a reasonable goal as far as how quickly and in what quantities you'd be able to enable small local farms to grow this wheat? Do you have any thoughts on, how do you get to at least a scale of economy that makes sense for small scale farms to grow this variety of wheat?
Well, you can grow it you have to have equipment, of course. When you're doing wheat, it's not something you can go out by hand, but that is really of a small scale. It's not like picking watermelon. So you need to have some kind of access to drills, to tractors, to thrashing machines, combines, something like that. I mean, if you're smaller than that, you need to go find neighbors that can go in together and rent machinery or something. So I don't know when they're saying small, how small you're talking about, but you have to have, it makes sense to have machinery. You just can't go out with a hand sickle and a hand thrasher and expect to achieve any kind of economy of scale. So that would be one consideration. If you're up to where you already have some of these machines in the first place, then it's very easy to just plant 20 acres or 50 acres or 100 or whatever, is a small portion of your farm, or 10 even. If you've got the equipment, it's easy. You have to have proper storage. You need to keep it dry and protected from birds, insects, and rodents. And that's about all you need. You need to have facilities close by that can clean it and then can mill it and then get the flour into the hands of bakers like Andy or home use. So that could be done in quite small, in small but significant operations.
Well, great. And there was another question on just kind of your process. Do you do you contract and buy any Kamut from other farmers, or do you kind of produce it all yourself? Do you mill it all on site? Kind of how does that, how does some of those relationships work?
Well, that Kamut expanded way beyond what our wildest dreams were in the beginning. We first planted a half acre in 1986. And we thought that this would be a novelty. And then when it took off, when people started asking for it and found that it made wonderful pasta and all kinds of other, almost anything you make out of wheat, it made a wonderful product. When we got it to Italy, actually we got it to Europe, and the Italians found it. We didn't think they would ever buy it in Italy because it's quite a bit more expensive. We pay farmers 3 to 4 to 5 or 6 times normal prices for wheat. It has a low yield potential because it's never been bred for high yielding, and so it finishes quite expensive compared to modern wheat, and so we didn't really expect that there would be a lot of market development in Italy, where the incomes aren't as great as some of the other places, especially in southern Italy. What we found, however, though, that the Italians loved it because they thought it was something that they once had and now had been rediscovered, sort of. And that became our greatest market with just a few years. They were taking 75% of everything we grew. And we grew to the point that we were up to 100,000 organic acres. And we contacted with 250 other organic farmers throughout Montana, Alberta, Saskatchewan. That's where it grows best because it's a spring wheat. It's a very close relative of durum. So where durum grows best, it grows best. So that's what we found. So it went beyond our farm in just a few years to a vast area of the Intermountain West, Northern Great Plains.
Great. And you mentioned earlier about, expressing the need to preserve the integrity of Kamut as you developed it. There's a question here just about, how it works for folks to grow it and purchase from you. Can you just provide a little bit more information and education as far as kind of how does that trademarking work and how do people access Kamut?
Well, to grow it, if you want to use the Kamut trademark, then you need to be a part of our Kamut family, our program. And we have guidelines which you can grow it. We ask our farmers to grow as part of being renewable, regenerative organic, we ask them to grow a green manure crop immediately preceding the planting of the Kamut Khorasan wheat. We make sure that they have a capability to keep it completely separate from all other wheat, particularly modern wheat. And we, in that contract, we promise, of course, to buy everything that they produce with a guaranteed price ahead of time. I'm not really involved in any of that anymore. I'm still involved with some of the research, but we have contractors in Montana, which are Montana Flour and Grain, which I sold also to my employees about 20 years ago, and they are the main contractors for America. And then we have Prairie Harvest Seeds in Saskatchewan, who contract for farmers in Saskatchewan. Those are our main contractors. We also have small projects in Australia, and we've experimented all over the world to see where this would grow best, but we came back to the Northern Great Plains is where we've had the best luck. So we don't really contract much out of that area. I've talked to Andy and some other folks in the grain school and in the Mad Egg group down in Colorado about doing a Colorado version of Kamut, and that can certainly be done. We're thinking about the same thing in some isolated communities in Nevada or the desert areas. You can also grow it in Colorado, in Southern California, and in Arizona and New Mexico, but they plant it in the fall there, and that's because their winters are so mild. But we can go through that. Those kinds of things can be done, but if they want to go into the regular Kamut Khorasan program, then we need to work with Montana Flour and Grain particularly. If you want to just grow the grain, we don't own the grain. I mentioned that before. We think grain is a gift from the crater in the first place. And so we make no effort to control the grain. And if people just want to take the seed and grow it for their own use or call it something else and make their own rules and quality control measures, they're free to do that. And so that's the other thing that it can be done and has been done in different places from time to time.
Wonderful. And just a couple more questions about production. Do you have a crop rotation, and what do you recommend, and how do you control kind of, invasive weeds like Canadian thistle, bindweed, and others? How does your
that's a really good question. We do have, to make a regenerative organic work in the northern Great Plains, we need quite an extensive crop rotations. We have a 9-year rotation on our farm. We grow 5 years of cash crops. And then in between those cash crops, we grow 4 years of soil building crops. We can only grow, right now, traditionally, we can only grow one cash crop every second year because our water is so short, and the limiting factor that we save up the water for 1 year to grow the cash crop the next year. So we're terminating our soil building crops normally in the middle of June. And then if they're very heavy, our soil building crops are crops like alfalfa, sweet clover, peas, lentils, legumes mostly. And especially crops like yellow blossom sweet clover, they can be 6 feet tall. When we disc that down, it just covers the ground as a thick mulch and protects the soil from wind and water loss and all the rest of the season. So it's not really no-till, but we're only tilling it once. So and then we can either go in the fall and plant winter wheat, or in the spring with our spring crops. So that's one thing that has been working well. I'm doing experiments now with kind of off-season cover crops, and I haven't got anything to report on that yet, but we're always looking for new ideas and ways that we can improve. With the Canada thistle, we're able to handle that with a few years of alfalfa. That's a really good competitor. With the bindweed, we're having a little more trouble with that, and we're looking for diseases, fungus or bacteria or something that can affect that weed and take it out as a plant disease. So those are the kind of things that we're working on. But the rotations for organic, particularly in the northern Great Plains, are essential to break up cycles of weeds, diseases, and pests, and of all kinds. And that's what we've found success with.
Hey, Bob, doesn't Monsanto have some effective tools for bindweed management?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, it's nuclear. It's a nuclear solution. Yes.
How do you think that's going to play out? It seems that Bayer may have gotten itself in a bit of a pickle there, and the lawsuits are actually starting to roll through successfully.
Well, yes. Now, and the main culprit is glyphosate, not because it's so much worse than anything else, but it's so much more prevalent than anything else. There's, I don't know, millions and billions of tons being spread across the earth. We have glyphosate in our rain now that falls on our farm, to the point that we're finding microscopic amounts of glyphosate in our products sometimes. So we're now experimenting with ways that we can mediate that in the soil and in the crops. But the best way to mediate the glyphosate problem, in my mind, is to go organic and reduce the need for glyphosate, or the demand, I should say. We don't really need it, but they've created a demand. And now so many farmers think that that's the only way they know how to farm. It's the only way they can be successful, but it's not true. They can actually be more successful without it. But I talked about the dogma. They're the ones that are really promoting the current dogma. And they don't want anything changed, and they want you to think that these problems are really not serious at all. But glyphosate is an antibacterial agent, and so it not only kills weeds by disrupting a particular metabolic pathway in plants. Those same metabolic pathways are found in bacteria. Many of bacteria have those, and so glyphosate kills those bacteria in the soil. And when you eat food that's tainted with glyphosate, it will kill it or disrupt their proper function in your gut. And so they're creating many more problems and diseases than anyone would have imagined because of secondary effects.
And I know that you were helping with the development of the National Organic Program early on. Are you still working with that group, and is it as strong as it was when you guys initially created it?
Well, the National Organic Program is a USDA program. So, I was serving on the first National Organic Standards Board. So it's not really like an organization, other than the input that the board gives, that you join up and be a part of. You can give testimony to the board, but it's not like other farm groups or organic promotive groups that promote organic agriculture. It's not like that. I'm still involved with some of those groups, the Organic Farmers Association, Organic Trade Association, our Montana Organic Association. I'm involved with all of those, and I try to continue helping those, being influenced wherever I go or wherever, any way I can. But the National Organics Board and the National Organic Program is really separate, and they've taken some turns we didn't expect and didn't really intend, and so we've been trying to do due diligence to get them to rein some of these things in that have been allowed recently, like confinement in dairy and chicken production that wasn't intended at all, and there's been a big effort to get rid of that and replacing it with pasteurization and non-confined operations.
Thanks.
So there's been a couple questions to potentially a reference around dryland vegetable production. Are you producing or growing any of your vegetables without irrigation? If you are, what has worked for you?
Well, the ones I've been working on that project for about 12 years now. And we started with potatoes and winter squash, and they went surprisingly well. The experiments we did was to figure out the proper spacing. So I've given the plants, each plant has about 3 times more area to grow in than irrigated crops. And if you look at places where they don't irrigate like the Midwest in Ohio or Iowa or Indiana or places like that, they get about 3 times more rain than we do. And so I could have figured that out, I guess, just by looking at the rain gauge statistics. But I worked it out by just using different plant spacing, and that's when I found that like our potato plants will produce about 2.2 to 2.5 pounds per plant. It's not so much different than there's many of them in the same field. In northern Montana, we have thousands of acres available to us. We're not really worried about using a little extra land because we're not paying for any irrigation. We're not paying for any water bills or anything like that. So we can afford, and the land is not as expensive here as it is where they can produce more, of course. So that's worked very well for us. From the squash, those 2 crops, we've gone to about 5 or 6 other crops. We found onions are very successful. I can grow summer squash. I can grow melons. Last year was a cold summer, but the year before we had over 30-pound watermelons on dry land with no irrigation. And when I went to Israel, I was told, well, watermelon's a desert plant. And I got some seed that was particularly adapted to growing it without irrigation. And I found that in traveling around the world, that many parts of the world don't have irrigation and still grow a lot of vegetables. And that's why I'm trying to demonstrate that there's certain things that we can have good success with. Now I'm growing tomatoes. I've tried broccoli, and that was a complete and terrible disaster because without extra water, the flavors were so intense that it was very strong. And I don't know that you'd have too many people interested in eating it compared to a much milder irrigated version. So that was the one thing that I found was really, really different that I didn't continue. But I've been continuing with a lot of other experiments like beets and carrots, and I continue with those to see how I can make those, if I can have the same success I have with potatoes and onions and squash.
Well, that's really fascinating around just the flavor profile between the difference between irrigation and dryland. That's fascinating. There was one question from Richard that asked that he said that he visited your farm in 2008 and you were experimenting with camelina grain for an oil crop. Just wanted to know if there was any updates on that and if that work is still happening.
Well, that's a whole nother story. The reason I got into the oil business in the first place was the idea of growing my own fuel. And camelina was touted as being the best choice for us because it bloomed earlier than canola, and we get hot here quite early in the summer or late in the spring, however you want to define it, and so we don't have as good as luck with canola. And so I got a press, and I raised a few years of camelina. We pressed it in oil, and I was a little discouraged, however, with the biodiesel production phase. You've got a glycerol byproduct. You've got a lot of wastewater. Then you have to spend a lot of money testing your end product to make sure the biodiesel reactions all went to completion, and it was a good quality fuel. When I went to Germany, I found manufacturer over there that was making adaptations to diesel engines that could burn straight vegetable oil without making biodiesel. And I became very interested in that. Unfortunately, it requires monounsaturated oils, and camelina is a polyunsaturated oil. And once you break it down to make biodiesel, it works fine. You esterify it, but it will not work well with long-chain fatty acids with lots of double bonds burning a straight vegetable oil in a diesel engine. But the monounsaturated with only one double bond in the fatty acid chains will burn. And so then I changed to high oleic safflower. And my hired man at the time took some into the local diner, and they said, well, this makes better fried chicken than anything we've ever had, and better French fries. So they wanted to use it in their cooking. And so they were going to pay me $2 a pound. So $2 a pound adds up to about $8 a gallon. And you can imagine if you're going to put fuel in your tractor for $8 a gallon, even at the highest cost of diesel, never reached that point. So that didn't make sense. But what did make sense is taking the waste oil then from the fryers and cleaning that, which we do with just a centrifuge and putting it through filters. And then we burn the waste oil or the used oil. So now we're using oil first for food and secondly for fuel. And we've ended, I think we can end the debate about food versus fuel and growing, using up our farm acres just to grow fuel by growing first food like oils and then using that used oil for fuel. So that's what I'm doing now, trying to perfect that.
Wow, that's a great story about how that's evolved and how you're able to reuse that.
Yeah.
There's a question around just soil health, and actually speaking about the specific of sometimes the perception. Is it true that grains like Kamut and einkorn actually improve soil quality compared to like an F2 wheat? Do you really notice any difference in the actual plant when it comes to soil health or soil quality?
I haven't really studied that question. Certainly the Kamut Khorasan, and I imagine spelt at einkorn too, because the older grains are bigger or taller grains, and usually your root mass that you don't see below the surface is in direct proportion to what you see above the surface. In other words, the biomass above the surface. So in most of those grains, you're having a larger root mass. So because you have a larger root mass, you have more interaction with bacteria, you have more exchange going on, and that in itself will certainly help increase soil health and build soils quicker and better. But I haven't really done the comparisons on that side by side to say what kind of percentages or what kind of things you can measure that are showing that. Maybe some people have, but I would certainly, just knowing that the root mass is different, know for sure that it is going to be a factor. I just don't know how much of one.
speaking of that, just having a taller crop, do you have any challenges with getting it to being fully ripe and ready to harvest with high winds or anything like that, or is that a challenge?
Well, only if it rains. At the same time, you get the high rain winds, and sometimes it does that. It can go down on you. We don't have so much of that in Montana because it's usually so dry here that they don't get as tall as what they would do on irrigation or with adequate rainfall, if you said it that way. I saw this kamut growing in Egypt in the delta there, and it was over 8 feet tall, getting close to 9, and it was huge. We'd never seen anything like that. If it's waist high here, that's a pretty average type of crop. We've had it up to shoulder height, but that's unusual. And the nice thing about it is, compared to modern wheat, especially the semi-dwarfs, if you're having a real drought year, the ancient grains have some drought resistance. And also they don't burn up, and if they are able to combine, they're still knee-high when the semi-dwarfs are down almost so close to the ground you can't cut them. So that's an advantage too.
Wow, that's great. And I think we have time for one more question. This just kind of goes back to digestibility with kamut. Is there do you have any ideas or any influence based on maybe process, like when it comes to like sourdough production versus other types of using yeast or other baking? Is it just the process itself of sourdough and that technique? Does that help with digestibility when it comes to gluten?
Yes, in a very significant way. So I tell people, if you have trouble with modern wheat and you want to see if you can enjoy wheat again, there's 4 things you should do. First of all is eat organic. So you're avoiding being tainted by chemicals. You should eat only ancient and heirloom wheats that haven't been bred and changed. You should eat whole grain. And finally, you should eat sourdough. And so what sourdough does is really pre-digest that gluten. So if you have trouble with gluten, even with modern wheat, sourdough will help that. But the more of those 4 that you can stack together, the more success you're going to have. So if you do ancient, organic, whole grain, and sourdough, you've got the best chance. The sourdough is really pre-digesting that gluten, depending on how long the sourdough process is. Some reports, research has said, I think it's 48 hours that you can take over 90% of the gluten is destroyed. That's huge. Most sourdough process doesn't go 48 hours, but the longer it goes, the more it's broke down. And therefore, what you eat, if it's partially digested or mostly digested, it makes finishing the job very easy for your system to handle. And we've done 1 or 2 studies, I think, that we published comparing sourdough and yeasted. And in both cases, the antioxidant capacity was higher. The anti-inflammatory stuff was higher. So both the health aspects are also not only the digestibility, but also increasing health is also a great benefit. So I'm a very big fan. I have sourdough kamut pancakes at least 2 or 3 times a week. And if I'm buying bread or can get sourdough bread, I prefer that over anything that's yeasted.
Well, this has been wonderful. We really appreciate you joining us for the hour. And thank you too, just for your contribution to the food system and all the work you've done over these years. It's really inspirational. So once again, thank you. Just wanted to remind folks on the call too that Bob has a blog called Organic Farmer, and you can also access his book called.
Well, it's actually Bob Quinn, Organic Farmer. So.
Okay, Bob Quinn, Organic Farmer. There you go.
Yeah, if you type in the whole thing, you'll get to it.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. And then also, if you want to see this video or check out any of the other Colorado Grain Chain homeschool videos, you can do that through coloradograinchain.com. You can also learn more about becoming a member. There's other member benefits, including private links. You can get recipes. You can find other resources on the website as well. But once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Have a great one, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.